Hello and welcome to Speak Online. What we're going to be doing tonight is taking a look at the news coverage, both left and right, and analyzing it, and then performing a fact check. So just a bit of media analysis so we can determine the truth of what is going on. Currently, there is a big push to remove the Department of Education. And what usually happens, or what I've noticed, is before an action is taken, there's significant news coverage in order to push that agenda. That includes social media. So we'll review some of that as well. And then primary coverage, for example, over YouTube of major networks. So let's take a look and see what we can determine. So we are going to start with NBC News. We'll write down the primary arguments made. Then we'll hit Fox, maybe take a look at social media and see what we can do. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. You can check us out on Spotify as well. I'm going to end up downloading these and putting out a daily podcast, hopefully, or every other day. Still kind of working things out, but it's coming together. So thank you, everybody, for the support.
The Senate is set to vote today on whether to confirm Linda McMahon as the nation's Secretary of Education. If confirmed, the former wrestling executive will take the helm of a department President Trump has vowed to dismantle. The White House has not said how or when it would shut the department down. And recently, we received a question from a viewer asking us to explain the function of federal departments, especially those being targeted by the Trump administration. So what does this agency do, and why is it under attack? Here's the Department of Education simply explained. Put simply, the Department of Education establishes policy for, administers, and coordinates most federal assistance to education.
The first role of the Department of Education is to redistribute funds to support education in states and school districts and in institutions of higher education.
Martin West is a professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education.
Function 2 is regulations that the department issues on the use of those funds. A third function of the department is to enforce federal civil rights laws. And then a final function of the department is in the research and development space to try to improve the operation of American schools.
Quick history lesson. The current cabinet-level Department of Education was established in 1980, created under President Jimmy Carter the year prior with support from the biggest teachers union in the country, the National Education Association, or NEA.
President sets to work.
We knew at the time that we were still in the throes of the Civil Rights Acts of the late 60s. And that the federal government needed to play a role in how our schools were funded.
Becky Pringle is the president of NEA and supports the Department of Education.
Making sure specifically that those communities that have been marginalized historically, that they had that extra support from the federal government.
It wasn't universally accepted. A smaller teachers union, the American Federation of Teachers, expressed concern that the new department would threaten the rights of states and local school boards. Paul Vallis is a policy advisor for Illinois policy and former superintendent in Chicago and Philadelphia. He points to recent results from the nation's report card, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that shows American students hitting new learning lows. Vallis argues that the Department of Education has failed to improve education outcomes and needs real accountability.
Getting rid of the department and handing those programs off to other agencies would allow the benefits to continue to flow down to local schools without the tendency for the Department of Education to be rather intrusive and sometimes in a way that I think works to the detriment of local control.
The law that created the Department of Education does not grant it the power to mandate curricula. But the department can enforce regulations like mandatory testing for schools that receive federal funding.
It's that regulatory role that gives the federal government, I think, more influence than you might expect given its limited financial stake.
By some estimates, the U.S. federal government currently provides 13.6% of all funding for K-12 public education. The rest is covered by state and local governments. As of today, the Trump administration has eliminated major teacher training programs, cut federal education research, and more.
I think their whole approach is to decentralize and to really leave it to the states and to the local school districts to make decisions.
As of today, the Trump administration 13.6% of all funding for K-12 public education. The rest is covered by state and local governments. As of today, the Trump administration has eliminated major teacher training programs, cut federal education research, and more.
I think their whole approach is to decentralize and to really leave it to the states and to the local school districts to make decisions on their curriculum, on their instruction, on their systems of accountability.
There's been a lot of talk about moving some of the programs and responsibilities to other departments, but those other departments are not specifically focused on education of our students.
The new administration bringing new changes to America's public education sector, and that's the Department of Education simply explained.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories.
Okay, that was good, and we got a lot of information from it. These are the primary claims that I got. So what does it do? The federal assistance to education. This is a big one. Then the FAFSA. I believe this is included for higher education. So funding for higher education. Then they have the Federal Service Rights Laws. It was established in 1980. Now, what we should be doing is doing a comparative analysis before it was actually formed and looking at it now. This is really important also to take in consideration COVID. You know, this is an outlying event, so the results are most likely skewed. Although I don't know that for a fact yet, but I do expect the scores to be less than ever since COVID has occurred due to the lack of education and the in-class time. But we'll take a look, see if that's true or not. We need to look at, has the recent DEI cuts already affected this? Then there is the primary argument, which is the lack of success. The right, as it was mentioned, they want to hold it accountable. I would suggest they do have a point. Why not do that and retain it? So, they said the feds don't mandate the education. So that's referring to, for example, a syllabus and what things are covered. I know that they don't for a fact regarding higher education, as when I worked in it. Then we had the 86.4% is funded by the state, and 13% by the federal. It says it's already cut funding, so I think we should take a look at what effect that will already have. Now, let's move to some right coverage. So let's go to Fox News. They could have covered a little bit more of the arguments on the right. They tried to take or frame it as education about the Department of Education, which they should. They are the news. It shouldn't be that much opinion, other than the opinions of the left and right and an explanation of that. And there wasn't that much explanation.
So President Trump reportedly set to issue an executive order aimed at eliminating the Department of Education as soon as today.
Senior White House correspondent Jackie Heinrich joins us now to tell us more. Hey, Jackie. Good morning, guys. According to the Wall Street Journal, the president could sign that executive order as early as today, directing Education Secretary Linda McMahon to, quote, take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Education Department based on the maximum extent appropriate and permitted by law. It's something the president has been angling for since his first days in office.
Why nominate Linda McMahon to be the Education Department Secretary if you're going to get rid of the Education Department?
Because I told Linda, I hope you do a great job and put yourself out of a job. I want her to put herself out of a job. Education Department. I want the states to run schools, and I want Linda to put herself out of a job.
McMahon reportedly signaled it was coming in an email to staff on Monday night, right after her Senate confirmation, saying she would send education back to the states. But much of the department's programs are codified by law, and Congress would have to scrap the department, with Democrats buying in to clear 60 votes in the Senate. Betsy DeVos, education secretary in the president's first term, was not able to get it done.
Since then, we had COVID, and Americans' eyes were open to just what an abject failure this federal agency has been at its mission. Shy of Congress actually dismantling and shutting down the department, one of the most important ways to get power back to a more local level is to simply take the funds appropriated by Congress and block grant them back to the states.
The Wall Street Journal reports some changes proposed by the Heritage Foundation could include moving the Civil Rights Division under the Department of Education over to DOJ, and also taking student loans and shifting them over to Treasury. So we'll see what happens, guys.
Wow. Thanks so much, Jackie. Yeah, so this was not unexpected, but for Linda McMahon to get confirmed in a couple of days, she decides she's going to wind it down. So you need 60 votes in the Senate to get rid of it. But in the meantime, can you begin to thin out the herd of people that you have working for you? Can you start to send the money to the states, even if the Education Department stays there while the Senate debates?
I think if the president takes all of these kids that are around the country that are on this waiting list or cannot afford a quality education because they're in the failing district, and he takes the money from the federal government and says, listen, I'm going to pay for you to go to charter school. The Democrats cannot object to this. If you object to parents sending their kids to a quality school, preventing the school to prison pipeline, I think it's just going to look bad. And it just showed you that the president will be common sense versus the Democratic Party with the teachers union.
Well, I mean, I know what your family did. You lived in Texas. Your parents moved so you could be in the best school district. Yep. And I know for New York City, most of the people in New York City have no choice. The schools are so bad. You had the public schools in most of the neighborhoods. You have to do private schools. So it'd be wonderful under school choice where Donald Trump says, I'll give you the money. Let's say it's, $40,000 per kid to go to school in New York City. So I'll give you that money and you get school choice. You can pay for a private school. It can go toward that. It can go toward whatever to pay for your child's education, so that the parents are in charge. Because if you live in a bad neighborhood, you're stuck. And the schools are bad, you're stuck, right?
But teachers unions want you stuck because they don't want their positions to go away. And they don't, for example, there's money for charter schools to open up all throughout the city. What they do, these Democratic governors squeeze them. That's right. They make them overcrowded, make them hard to get into, make it a lottery system. So they don't open up, even though they have the classrooms, they have the buildings, they still don't open it up. So you could say you should do it and you feel the pressure, but Democrats don't feel the pressure.
And by the way, we support teachers as well. We want quality teachers. We want teachers to get raises as well. But we got to stop. Something is going wrong in our education system, and I think it's the lack of competition. I think the competition needs to happen. If a school is failing, why should we keep it open? We're failing our kids, and a lot of those kids are ending up in prison, and I just don't think that's what's right for society.
All right, we'll see. We got to get the grades up. It's easy to see if there's improvement because we know right now we're at the bottom of the industrialized nations.
Okay. We're at the bottom of industrial nations. Okay.
I want to bring the schools back to the states. And, I've said it 100 times. We're ranked at the bottom of the list, and yet we spend more. We're ranked number one for cost per student. We're ranked at the bottom of the list in education.
President Trump is aiming for his education secretary, Linda McMahon, to put herself out of a job, and he might help move the process along very soon. Reports say Trump is preparing an executive order to dismantle the department as much as the law will allow. Democrats, they're not too happy about it. Watch.
Do we need to make the Department of Education more efficient? I believe we do. Do we need to destroy it and wreak havoc for working class families across this country? Absolutely not.
He's using your kids' education money to give tax breaks to his billionaire buddies.
They are sick to death that they don't have their hands inside the Department of Education Treasury. What they want to do is to sell off our public schools to the highest bidder.
No, they got all those wrong. Funding the department that's failing our children sure ain't cheap. In 2024 alone, it spent a total of $268 billion, only to be met with record low grades.
Joining us now is former Department of Education Press Secretary, Under Secretary Betsy DeVos, Angela Morabito. Angela, it's so good to have you join us this evening, because we know that Secretary DeVos has long been an advocate for shrinking the department, even dismantling it. And so I want to ask you, when we hear talks about, Trump preparing an executive order, bringing about these massive changes as much as the law will allow, is it eliminating the Department of Education more about budget issues as we're trying to slash costs across Washington, or is it more about changing curriculum and empowering parents at the state level?
So that's a great question, but it's not really an either or, it's a both and. By getting rid of the federal Department of Education, we can cut billions of waste, fraud, and abuse. I'm honestly stunned by what DOJ has uncovered less than 2 months into President Trump's second term. But also, by getting rid of this federal bureaucracy, we can send more federal education dollars to the states, and in doing that, empower parents to make the best decisions for their children. So de-woking education and getting rid of wasteful spending can both be accomplished, or at least accelerated substantially, by getting rid of a federal department that has failed in its mission.
Hey, this is one of my favorite things that President Donald Trump is doing, is to abolish the Department of Education. They have 4,500 employees. You don't need a middleman. Let the dollars flow to the kids. All those curmudgeons on the Democratic side telling you that they're trying to get their hands into the schools and their tax breaks for billionaires. Hogwash. That's not what's going to happen. Dollars follow the kids. Implement more school choice. Get parents, get them involved, get the school districts, and leave it to the states is the right direction. But some states, they won't necessarily know how to handle it. And Angela, what I want to get your reaction to, because it's a stunning number. According to a new report, more than one third of New York City public school kids were chronically absent last year. That amounts to 300,000 students in the country's largest public school system were chronically late last year.
It's absolutely horrifying, but honestly, it's not that surprising, because 5 years ago this month, we had teacher union bosses and their political allies start to tell every family in America that school was non-essential. We all know that's not true. School is essential, but of course, some families believed them and they're not sending their kids to school. Now, one fix for this is school choice. Let parents choose where their kids will learn, send them somewhere they want to go. But you see this in major cities like New York City, which isn't alone, by the way. This is happening all across the country, especially in urban areas. And I have to tell you, I see these numbers and I just can't blame some of these kids, because these schools are failing to teach their students to read, write, and do math. And it is the height of disrespect for families to expect them to keep showing up at places that just don't deliver a meaningful education.
Angela, it's such a good point, because on the recent national test results, it showed that only 1/3 of 8th grade students, I should say, as much as 1/3 of 8th grade students scored below basic in reading, which is the worst performance on the assessment since 1969, so more than 50 years. That means that they're missing out on context clues, and that's coming when you look at the state of New York, where we have a lot of spending to educate just one student here in the state, $30,000 for one student. So you raised some really important points here. What do you think is going to take to turn the disastrous performance in schools around? How long, how many years of reversal will it take to fix this?
I think this can be fixed relatively quickly as long as adults start acting like adults so that kids can be students and they can get that education they deserve. This means getting rid of the federal education bureaucracy. This means returning to high standards in states. Teacher union bosses have fought against every measure of accountability in schools, from standardized testing to teacher evaluations to read by 3 laws that ensure kids have those basic skills. So it's going to take leadership at all levels of government to get back there. But what we've seen in places like Mississippi and Louisiana is that when those pieces fall into place and we've got great literacy education, things happen really fast.
Well, and they also got to secure those schools so the kids aren't scared to go to school. Angela Morabito, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Do appreciate it.
Okay. We got a lot there. A lot there.
Welcome back. Democrats are in a tailspin.
Okay. So, one, we have this consistent push from the right about charter schools. So we're going to take a look at that, and I do have some very interesting information regarding it. But we'll get to it in a minute. They want the state to run the schools. I think a good question is, can President Trump actually enact this by executive order? Another individual we got that joined the show is Linda McMahon. We should ask who she is, what her qualifications are. I mean, is she even qualified to speak about this? What experience does she have? Another note, if it is done by legislation, they need 60 votes to pass it. So it would require Democrat support. Good question to ask is, are there any Democrats that are for this? Can it be done? Are they going to have to take a different method in order to shut it down? They mentioned DOJ, that they are already cutting funding. Is that going to be the way that they take it? Another thing, they mentioned how that one individual's parents moved to another area to send their child to a better school district. Now, a claim regarding that, you have to assume that the parents are going to be able to afford to move in order to send them where they want. Can they do that? The knocking of the public education system, give it to the parents that it should be their choice. But again, do they even have that choice? There was a consistent theme about knocking teachers' unions. Kids going to prison. I think we've heard this before, the prison pipeline, that we are at the bottom of industrial nations when it comes to education, the selling off of public schools. Betsy DeVoy, she came into this. Maybe take a look at her. The federal bureaucracy, that's another common claim. The chronically absent, 308,633. If they can get a meaningful education, that it was better than 1969, and how long it will take to fix this. So we got a lot of claims. One of the primary things that I already see between the left and the right coverage is the talking points that happen. So the talking points, and by that I mean the little snippets, right? That it is a bureaucracy, things like that. They have a lot of talking points that are repetitive. This is a common tactic. You will hear the same arguments over and over again. What I would argue that is for is it provides the public a talking point, So you start a discussion, you start just listing off all these talking points, but do you actually know what the hell you're talking about? Most people don't, but it sounds good and it's effective as well. So it's a good strategy to take when it comes to media and getting it out into the public. Okay. So the talking points, those are consistent. But is there any information to actually back it up? Noted. And fix the spelling on that. So let's start with fact checking. Let's go to fact check regarding the Department of Education and claims. Now, a consistent theme that's been in the media, especially on the right, is that these fact-checking organizations are biased. You can make that claim, but you can also make the claim that on one side, there are more claims that are false. So there's more to check. And I think we've all noticed, whether you're on the left or the right, that many of the claims made that are coming out of the president's mouth are not particularly accurate. So there is more to check. So, issues the Department of Education. This is a good one. So, this states that Trump is wrong about U.S. rank in education spending and outcomes. Throughout this, I'm just going to be taking notes, and then at the end we can review it. Then I'll probably write up an article and then publish it as well. Okay. I think we can all see that all right. Maybe zoom in just a bit. I think it's really important for people to actually see this evidence, just because, again, we get talking points and the coverage is so short and it's also sensationalized, and we've moved to a state of infotainment so that people are engaged. It increases watch time, and when you increase watch time, you can put more ads in it. So individuals are making more money. The corporations can, and by that I mean the distributors, can then charge more because more people are watching. So, again, I'm going to be taking a look at Trump wrong about U.S. rank in education spending and outcomes. And this is from factcheck.org. So, as justification for dismantling the Federal Department of Education, President Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed that U.S. schools are ranked 40 out of 40 in educational outcomes compared with other countries, while the U.S. ranked number 1 in cost per pupil. Neither claim is accurate. So that is regarding the cost of student. A good way to think about this, and it's a big selling point for colleges, is the amount of teachers in comparison to students. This is a big selling point for universities because the thought is that your education will be better if there are more teachers per student. So the pupil will get more one-on-one time. The professor or teacher is more available, right? So again, we got that is regarding the cost of students and rank. That is false. Okay. Continuing forward. U.S. high school students performed above average in science and reading, and a bit below average in math, according to the latest data compiled by the Intergovernmental Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And in other international assessments, elementary students in the U.S. scored above average in math, science, and reading. During the campaign, Trump made no secret of his desire to dismantle the federal Department of Education. As President Trump said, that remains his goal. Trump told reporters on February 4th that he had said to Linda McMahon, his nominee to be Education Secretary, "Linda, I hope you do a great job and put yourself out of the job." That's a good line, isn't it? Trump said he wants to let the states run schools and that he would funnel most of the funding for the Department of Education to states. As a technical matter, states and local communities already run the schools, setting the curriculum and teacher certification standards. As the Department of Education explains, the federal role in education is as a kind of emergency response system, a means of filling gaps in state and local support for education when critical national needs arise. In practice, Fine Law explains the federal government focuses on providing supplementary support and coordination at the national level. For instance, it implements programs and provides crucial services to disadvantaged populations, and it recommends teaching strategies. Interesting. So, one, what exactly is the federal government funding? I think that's an important question that should be asked. Let's see what this link brings about. Good. Federal role in education. We'll look at that in a minute. Moving on. According to the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, federal government funding made up about 11% of the revenues for elementary and second public schools in the 2020-21 school year. That's pretty close to what we heard. I believe it was about 13% by Fox News. The rest of the revenues come from state and local funding. Trump has said his plan is to effect a virtual closure of Department of Education in Washington and instead give federal education funds directly to states. In response to a reporter's question on February 4th about whether he intended to shutter the Department of Education, Trump repeatedly came back to his false claims about the U.S. ranking in education achievement and the country's per pupil spending. We spend more money per pupil than any other nation in the world, and yet we are rated number 40, Trump said. So, one thing that is important about that claim is, remember, we are talking about the specific funding of the feds, okay? So, it is 13%, 11% here, pretty close. But that statement is combining both of them. So if the states can do whatever they want, that is the 86%. They are referring to that total amount. Does that make sense? In other words, this claim is lumping both the state and the federal funds. But the federal funds are actually about providing a different assistance. So those with disabilities, minority classes, things like that. I think that's really important to note. The last rating came out, you saw them. So they talk about 40 countries. We are rated number 40. We have to tell teachers unions we are rated last in the world in education of the top 40. The thing just came out. That's under former President Joe Biden. Remember that. Again, one thing that happened was COVID. We should note that Trump has been making the same claims for years, as far back as when he was running for president in 2016. As we wrote in May 2016, he was wrong on both counts, as he is now. His campaign at the time did not respond when we asked for a source for the claims, and neither did the White House press office when we made a similar request this week. Education outcomes. We could find no international ranking of education outcomes that has the U.S. dead last, as Trump claimed. And this is true. When Trump mentions 40 peer countries, he appears to be talking about the 37 OECD countries that participate in the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, which the NCES conducts in coordination with the OECD every 3 years in reading, math, and science for 15-year-old students. The latest results are from 2022. In no PISA category, however, does the U.S. rank last. Rather, the U.S. scored above average among OECD countries in reading and science, subjects in which the U.S. ranked 6th and 12th, respectively. The average U.S. score in math was lower, but not significantly, than the OECD average. The U.S. ranking in math was 28th. Here's a more detailed breakdown of the PISA. Before we get into that, I want to check out a graph of these reading and math scores and see if there's a significant difference after COVID. So, reading and math scores. Graph and statistics. Most recent. Okay. Here is this one. We have definitely seen this before. Okay. So the most recent was in 2024. Here this is, let's see, they're done by 4 years. So that's going to be 2019 right here, 2018, 2017, 2016. When were COVID, or when were schools closed due to COVID? Let's verify the year. April 8th, 2020. Okay. So here's 2020, right about here. And you can see there was a significant drop right after COVID. So this makes sense that it would happen, but my point is that we were on a considerable rise in test scores from about 1992 to about 2016. Did drop a little bit, but it stayed consistent. Then we had COVID closures in public schools, and then there was a significant drop. And that makes sense for that to happen because, again, students were not in class and then, therefore, most likely not studying as much. So I would consider all these claims, at least when they are parroted to the public from 2020 to 2024, irrelevant. They are not good points of information due to an outline event in the public. So I don't know why the left isn't responding to that and just saying, that's complete BS due to COVID. They need to do that. Here's a more detailed breakdown of the PISA results. So this is returning back to the article. In reading, the U.S. average score of 504 was higher than the OECD average score of 476. Compared with the other 36 participating OECD members, the U.S. ranked 6th. That's good. Ireland and Japan were tied for the top ranking with an average score of 516, and Colombia was lowest with a score of 409. Looking at all of the 81 countries in the dataset, including non-OECD countries, the U.S. ranked 9th. Hold on a second. I want to make a note that the COVID results are irrelevant after 2020. The results are skewed due to the outline event that removed students from public schools. Okay, getting back to it. In science, the U.S. score of 499 was higher than the OECD average of 485. Among the 37 participating OECD countries, the U.S. ranked 12th. Japan was highest with a score of 547, and Mexico was lowest with a score of 410. Looking at all 81 countries in the PISA study, the U.S. ranked 16th. In math, the U.S. average score of 465 ranked 28th out of 37 OECD countries. The U.S. score was lower than the OECD average of 472, though the difference was not statistically significant. The country with the highest average score was Japan, and the lowest was Colombia. Looking at all of the 81 countries in the PISA data, the U.S. math literacy score ranked 34th. And that's a consistent claim, that 34th, I've noticed, on both sides. Notably, the situation was very similar in the 2018 PISA assessment during Trump's first term in office, as in 2022, the U.S. performed above the OECD average in reading and science and below the OECD average in math. Here's a note. We should also note that U.S. scores in math, science, and reading in 2022 were all lower than in 2018. And that's what we've seen, right? And that's an important note due to the pandemic. And I think they're going to make that. But the U.S. ranking compared with the other OECD countries was relatively the same or better because scores around the world dipped during post-pandemic. So there we go. It happened around the world, and they all dropped. From 2018 to 2022, the OECD average in PISA dropped by almost 15 points in math. It dropped by 13 points in the US, by about 10 points in reading, and remained stable in science, which we've seen as well in that graph, according to the OECD. Quote, the unprecedented drops in mathematics and reading point to the shock effect of COVID-19 on most countries. Thank you for validating my opinion. Moving forward, a second international assessment of students is known as the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, which is given every 4 years to 4th and 8th grade students. In 2023, with an average score of 517 in math, U.S. 4th graders scored 14 points above the international average and ranked 28th out of 63 countries. In science, the U.S. average score of 532 was also above the international average by 38 points, and the U.S. ranked 15 out of 63 countries. So the general argument is the U.S. isn't that bad, right, in education. That's the point that they're making. Let's move on to the next. So let's make a note that the general arguments for the U.S. being the worst are false. And mind you, on the right, there weren't too many people directly stating that claim. They were just saying it's not worth the money, basically, for what we're paying. It would be interesting to compare the amount that these other countries are investing in education, right? To see if there is a relationship between the amount of money and the quality of education. And you see how complicated these things like actually are if you get into the topic? There's a lot of research to be done. It's easy to state a talking point, but to explain how things actually are, to provide evidence for the claim, it takes a significant amount of time. It really does. And our news is not set up for an hour-long conversation or 2 hours regarding all the points to be made. So this is the value behind it and why I'm doing it. The spending per pupil argument. Trump was always wrong to say that the U.S. spends the most per pupil. Okay, so that cost per pupil is a false claim. This is the point that I just made, actually. Probably they're going to compare it. The cost of higher education, college-level education, is very high in the U.S. according to the OECD. U.S. expenditures for tertiary education, that is post-high school, including college, were the highest among OECD countries in 2021. Okay, let's make sure we got that. The cost of higher education, college level, is very high in the U.S. Let's make a note on that. So, the college level. I would be willing to guess right now that that is due to the FAFSA loans that are given. Most likely. And they would be expensive because if you've been to college, you know how the hell expensive college is, right? Getting back to it. So the U.S. expenditures for tertiary education post-high school, including college, were the highest among OECD countries in 2021 at $36,274 per pupil. That was 77% higher than the OECD average. According to the OECD, 39% of U.S. spending for higher education was public expenditure. I want to make a note of how expensive this is and something that can solve it. I was given a scholarship during my graduate school where I can work for the university. In this case, I was a graduate teaching assistant and get my education stipend. I think if they did this more often, of course, I guess they do have to pick it based on the individual. But if they created more positions where they could work and lower their tuition, it would help. And in my opinion, it would also give more practical application of their education. Here's one way. They could provide it as a funded internship because there would be more of those available. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. That if a student takes on an internship, even with a company outside the university, they get their tuition stipend. They are contributing to society, and often many internships are not paid. This is done commonly in unions. When I went through my steam fitter apprenticeship as well, we work while we are going to school. So we are getting that practical application. And that is a very good way to approach it. But getting back to the article, but a handful of other countries spent more than the U.S., primarily on primary and secondary schooling. For example, while the total spending per pupil at the primary level elementary school in the U.S., $15,270, was 28% higher than the OECD average, $11,902. The U.S. ranks 6th behind Luxembourg, $25,584, Norway, $18,037, Iceland, $16,786, Denmark, $15,598, and Austria, $15,415. According to the OECD, 93% of total expenditures on primary institutions come from public sources in the U.S. That is important, that the 93% of total expenditures on primary institutions comes from public sources. And I believe by public, they mean state, possibly. Making a note of that. And that the U.S. does not spend more. Okay. Another way to look at education spending is as a percentage of gross domestic product. By that measure, according to OECD data, the U.S. again is nearly top for post-secondary education. But at the primary and secondary school levels, U.S. per pupil spending in 2021 was below that of more than a dozen countries, including Israel, Iceland, Norway, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Costa Rica. Quote, "The U.S. spends a lot in education, if you include all the money spent on higher education." Andrew Crook, press secretary for the American Federation of Teachers, told us via email, "If you only consider K-12 education, U.S. expenditures are very close to the OECD average." Interesting. OECD data indicate that while the U.S. prioritizes higher education, other countries invest more comprehensively across all levels of education, Crook said. So one thing that was noted that I heard was about there are no federal requirements, or not necessarily requirements, but they do not mandate what is taught. Now, maybe the question comes up, should they? I mean, what if we did set specific standards or set up a specific curriculum? That could assist. Especially if, let's say, we increase funding, might be a reasonable thing to ask due to that increased amount. What if we required certain things to be taught? Interesting idea. Also, I think it's important that it's noted that we don't allocate an equal amount to all educational levels. I would say that, the K-12 education should be funded equal to or more, just because it's that base of knowledge that's set, than post-secondary. The OECD data indicate that while the U.S. prioritizes higher education, other countries invest more comprehensively across all levels of education, Crook said. Crook also warned that international spending comparisons aren't always straightforward. Many services that American schools provide are not part of other countries' educational expenditures, Crook said. For instance, many countries provide universal health care, which is funded separately from their education budgets, whereas in the U.S., healthcare costs for students and staff may be partially covered within school funding. Additionally, expenditures on services like student transportation, social programs, and other support systems vary widely across countries, further complicating a one-to-one comparison of education spending. Regardless, U.S. spending per pupil is not, as Trump repeatedly claims, higher than all other nations, nor does the U.S. rank last in educational outcomes. Interesting points. What that last paragraph was about, just to summarize, is the comparison is not necessarily equivalent due to the fact that the U.S. may allocate funds in areas that aren't necessarily devoted to education. So the healthcare costs, for example, things like that, the staff being partially covered within the school funding. I think that's an important note. that the equivalence is false in funding. Interesting. So we're getting a lot of claims, I would say primarily of equivalence being made that are false. That is important. In other words, they're not lies, but they should not be made. Okay. One thing I think is important to look at is who's making these claims or pushing this agenda. That was Linda, Miss Linda. Who is the 13th United States Secretary of Education. Interesting. So, I want her. Here we go. Let's see what this is. Shortly after high school graduation, Vince asked her to marry him. They married on August 26, 1966. Don't really care about that. So she did go to college, East Carolina University, in 1966, where she obtained a bachelor's degree in French. So not really a practical application education. But the academic program she completed was designed to prepare teachers for instruction. Okay, so she could have been a teacher. From 1968 to 1971, Vince worked as a traveling cup salesman before joining his father's company, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Okay. So I would argue that her work experience is nothing when it comes to it. I don't believe she ever applied her education in the field that she got it in. But she does have a bachelor's degree. I would think that she would find the value of it. But then again, if she never applied it, she might not necessarily find it valuable. Her early career. She worked as a receptionist. Financially compared. So I would say that she's a bit biased. I'd be curious about where she got this belief that it's not a good thing. But the primary thing is, she's never worked in education. So what the hell does she know? Right? If she's never been in it or worked for it, how does she know necessarily what works? What has she observed? Like, what has worked and what's not if she's never worked in it? So I really don't care about what the hell her opinion is. And it's primarily just a waste of time because she's taking it from other sources and possibly other sources that she knows nothing about. So you can go away. I don't really care. Okay. So I'm just going to make a note of that. Linda, everything she says is a waste of time. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Linda. Let's see. Knocking teachers' unions. I want to go into something about charter schools. Now, I found an interesting article regarding charter schools, and if it was related to possibly, segregation. So let's look up charter schools and segregation. The reason why I looked this up is I did a video on a KKK interview and modern political rhetoric. One thing that consistently came up in this was a theme about education. Now, back then in 1982, they didn't mention specifically charter schools, but things change, right? We develop new labels and new names to push different agendas. And mind you, I'm not saying that these people are pushing a agenda with a racist intention, right? But there is a reason why we have the term systemic racism. And it's because, although we don't push that agenda, that the institution may in fact support it. And that's an important comment to make. So, interesting. AI actually came up with it right at the top. They note that increased segregation, studies indicate that the expansion of charter schools is linked to a rise in racial and socioeconomic segregation within school districts. Now, I'll give an initial critique about the studies. Is if you're looking this up, you need to find a study that is primarily focused on large population areas. For example, if I do a study that goes to white suburbia and only looks at, let's say, towns with a population of 10,000 people, median income, let's say about 60 to 80,000, a high education level, it's going to show that there isn't any segregation because everybody's going to be white, right? So your sample has to be pulled from areas that have a large population. That is a really important thing. Otherwise, it's going to be skewed and not show that there's actual segregation. If you only pull from areas that are 96% white, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get a valid data set, which is why I found a very good one. This is from the UCLA, I believe. Here we go. So this is from the UCLA, the Civil Rights Project. Let me read about the sample. They examined schools in districts that had at least 5 charter schools and 5 magnet schools. The term magnet school means public schools in any year since 2000. This selection includes most of the 100 largest school districts, since both types of schools developed mostly in large urban districts. This sample is especially relevant to choice policies because it allows comparison in the same districts where both types of school choice have been tried at a significant level. This study describes the level of segregation in recent decades in large districts, which had a significant presence of schools of both types. So this is very important. I'm going to read the results, and then we'll move forward. The new data on school segregation produced for this report supports the following major findings. Charter schools, I'm going to zoom in here a bit so you can see this a little bit better for those who are watching. Okay. Charter schools grew rapidly in the last 20 years, with enrollment eventually surpassing magnet schools by more than 1 million students in recent years. Charter school enrollment grew especially fast, approximately 900% since 2001. In 2021, magnet schools, again public schools, were less segregated than comparable charter schools along multiple measures. The average black student in a magnet school was in a school that was 15% white, compared to charter schools where the average black student was in a school that was only 8% white. Over the last 20 years, Latino to white exposure increased in magnets and decreased in charter schools. The charter sector had a high proportion of intensely segregated schools than the magnet sector, and the gap between the two sectors increased over time. The proportion of intensely segregated charter schools with less than 10% white students increased from 45% to 59% from 2000 to 2021. A different trend was observed for magnets. The share of magnets that was intensely segregated was nearly the same in 2000 to 2021, 34% and 36%. So, this is very important. I'm going to read this real quick. An obvious explanation for this is that a basic mission of magnets, especially initially, was to address racial isolation. Policymakers interested in gaining the benefit of integration through choice might look closely at magnet schools. Nonetheless, magnet schools are not the only or even the best ways to produce substantial integration. The kinds of integration plans that increased integration substantially in the 1960s and 1970s did not primarily involve magnets. The higher segregation in charter schools observed in this analysis, coupled with other studies with similar findings, suggests that reforming charter schools, if not advancing alternatives like magnet schools, or something even more powerful. A note to make on this as well: if you remove the Department of Education and all the federal funding, which we've found that most of the funding is to enforce things that promote inclusivity, then these charter schools who don't have federal funding don't have to enact it. There is no force. You can say, hey, you don't do this, we're not going to give you any money. It's going to be up to the state, maybe the county, things like that support a specific agenda. And some of this stuff you can say, oh, it's a percentage point, it doesn't really matter. But over time, on a longitudinal outlook, it does have a long-term effect. So, I think that's an important message to get out there because I haven't heard that message much in the media, and it really needs to be put out there. Really needs to be. Okay. Another talking point I wanted to mention, this federal bureaucracy. That's a great talking point. It sounds good because one of the common themes put out on the right is this anti-authority complex. And they've pushed it so that we don't respect people who actually should be the fuck talking about it. We have seen this with the anti-vaccine movement, other things such as that. Well, it's the common claim of, they're trying to hide it. They're trying to hide it. It's they. It's them. Well, who the hell are they? Do you even know? Why don't you point them out? It sounds good, but it's complete BS. And the federal bureaucracy thing, point it out. Give me a good example. You say that this is fraud and wasteful spending, but just because you don't agree with it, it doesn't make it fraud. That's an illegal thing, and they'd be suing people for it. It's just, if you don't like it, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't. That's just your opinion. There are many people that do care about it and feel that it's a valid thing. So why the hell should we listen to you? Let's see. This chronically absent claim. I want to look into that. Just because I want to see if it should obviously increase post-COVID or during COVID. So when are they pulling that up? Chronically absent students stat. Here's a rate. Rates of chronic absenteeism. Okay. Let me zoom in on this. (2018 to 2019), Illinois 17.5%, Indiana 10.6%. From 2021-2022, it did increase a great deal. For example, let's look at Kansas. 2018-2019, 13.9%, to 2021-2022, 25.4%, 2022 to 2023, 21.8%. So, obviously, there's a difference. So, depending on when they are using that is really important. Here's an interesting thing. It explains the difference between truancy and chronically absent, which is important because they said specifically chronically absent. Here's the definition. Chronically absent means a child enrolled in a school under the jurisdiction of a local or regional board of education whose total number of absences at any time during a school year is equal to or greater than 10% of the total numbers of days a student is enrolled during such school year. Absence means an excused absence. Okay. That's a good term. That's a good term. They should be using that. Okay. One thing that I am concerned about is they used this talking point to lump in their agenda against unions. So we heard about knocking teachers' unions. I'm worried about that because it does push the agenda to get rid of unions. We're also seeing this with the attack on the LNRB. And I am biased to this just because I am a member of a union. My father was too, but one of the big things with unions that is important to keep in mind is they're a great way to provide upward mobility in socioeconomic status, also in education. It's really, really important, primarily because you're making a lot more money. It gives you the ability to move, to go to these better schools that they're talking about. Okay. 60 votes in the Senate needed. So they need Democratic support. I wonder if there are any Democrats that support this.
Spending money. Ukraine is another good example in Eastern Europe. They are spending billions of dollars.
Okay. The only thing that has any relevance, I would say, is Doge cutting federal funding. That's all that has to say. But did you notice the comment about federal bureaucracy? Again, a consistent theme, consistent term that's used. But what the hell do they mean? And is it relevant? That's another question. But what I want to look at is where these federal funds are actually going. Let's see, President's FY 2025 budget request for education. Press release. Budget summary. Here we go. Provides program information and detailed budget tables. This is the fiscal year 2025 budget summary. Let's take a look. Title I grants to local educational agencies. Grants to state. Here's a quote. from Miguel Cardona, Secretary of Education, about Biden's. President Biden's budget raises the bar in education by investing in evidence-based strategies and partnerships that will improve outcomes from cradle to career. With these investments, we can deliver an excellent education to all students, improving learning conditions, build pathways to college and careers, and increase post-secondary education affordability and access. Okay. That's great. Give me the numbers. Over the fiscal year 2025, budget requests $82.4 billion in discretionary funding for the Department of Education, including a change in mandatory program. And I need to get my camera going. There we go. K through 12 education proposes new and additional investments to lift student achievement using evidence-based strategies. Okay, this is just telling me the increase, not specifically what it's doing. Here we go. It increases support for children with disabilities. Every child with a disability should have access to the high-quality early intervention, special education services, and personal needed to thrive in school and graduate ready for college or a career. The budget provides an additional $205 million over the fiscal year 2024 annualized CR level for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA. Part B grants to states and preschool programs to support special education and related services with a total request of $14.8 billion. The budget also provides $545 million for IDEA Part C grants, which support early intervention services for infants and toddlers with disabilities, which have a strong track record of improving academic and developmental outcomes. $5 million over the fiscal year 2024 annualized CR level. This increased funding would support states in implementing critical reforms to expand their enrollment of underserved children, including children of color, children from low-income backgrounds, and children living in rural areas. The budget also invests $164 million in IDEA Part D grants to prepare special educators. Good. That's a good thing. You know, one thing, and I made this argument regarding the DEI and DEIA, or DIE, Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity, is if they actually read what they are, you would be like, what the hell are you talking about? Why would we cut these good things? You know, it sounds great. We're cutting this, but what the hell are you cutting? Most people would be like, man, that sounds like a really good thing that supports a minority population. We should do that. Okay, supports multilingual learners. That's good. Budget provides $940 million for Title III under the Every Student Succeeds Act, an increase of $50 million over the fiscal year. I would expect that they would be against this, especially due to the fact that they just made education, or not education, but English, the legal primary language in the U.S. That was the first. Reimagines the high school to post-secondary transition. The budget includes $57 million for the career-connected high school programs. This is great. This program provides competitive grants to partnerships between school districts, institutions of higher education, including community colleges, and employers to increase the integration and alignment of the last 2 years of high school, and the first 2 years of post-secondary education. We should all be behind this a great deal. Like I talk about with the apprenticeships involved with unions, the great thing about them is you are getting a post-secondary education. Usually, at least ours is equivalent to an associate's degree. And you also have a requirement for X amount of hours in order to graduate that program of on-the-job training. This is excellent. An excellent thing. Here, listen to this. Strategies include dual enrollment, work-based learning, college and career advising, and assistance for students obtaining industry recognized credentials. This thing right here, career advising, extremely important. I did a lot of research into first-generation college students in my graduate school, and a big thing that I found is first-generation college students do not have the tacit knowledge that is passed down from a college family. So basically, you know how you're in an environment that promotes certain things, certain behaviors, let's say even language use. If you're in a family that uses explicit language, you're most likely going to adopt that behavior tacitly. Not because your parents said, hey, I want you to curse, cuss, and things like this, but because you're around it. So, when it comes to education, those who come from an educated home have this stuff already planned out. Their parents can tell them, this is what you're going to do. You're going to graduate high school, you're going to go to college, you're going to get an internship, and then you're going to move into your career. But if you don't know what the hell you're doing, if you don't even know why you should pick this specific field, you're not going to know what to do. And you might waste your time in college. So, this education of a post-secondary transition, the funding for it is extremely important, as it will help the success of the individual post-university. Here we go. An Education Beyond High School proposes historic investments in college affordability. The budget would increase the discretionary maximum Pell Grant by $100 for the 2025-2026. Okay, that ain't much. Award year, building on successful efforts to raise the discretionary maximum award by $1,000. Okay, so this Pell Grant is extremely important. It is given primarily to those from a low-income household. So, for example, I got it, and first-generation college students, and it makes a huge, huge difference. Because again, a lot of times you don't know what the hell you're doing. And it gives you a little bit of time to figure that the hell out. So, that is a big deal. It's too bad it's only $100. Makes significant commitments to post-secondary student success, completion, and support. Okay, so one thing that we can see is a lot of the claims made, like for example in the Factcheck, that we primarily put money into post-secondary education. It sounds like it's true. Sounds like it's true. I would say it is true. Makes significant commitments to post-secondary student success, completion, and support. Let's see. The budget also invests $12 million in the Open Textbooks pilot to reduce textbook costs for students by supporting projects at institutions to create new open textbooks or expand their use while maintaining or improving instruction and student learning outcomes. And this is really nice because university college level textbooks are extremely expensive. Extremely expensive. Increases equitable funding for HBCUs, TCCUs, MSIs, and community colleges. Good. Community colleges should definitely be funded. The budget would enhance institutional capacity of HBCUs, yeah, we read that, and low-resource institutions, including community colleges, by providing an increase of $143 million over the fiscal year. I want to make a note about one thing. Commonly, we hear this: the invested monies are wasted, or they are put to things that don't matter. Don't these things sound like they matter and are important for society? These social investments make a difference. They make a huge difference. Prioritizes the needs of students and borrowers. Good. Bolsters our nation's skilled workforce with expansions to career and technical training and adult education. Again, I think that is a very, very good thing. The budget invests more than $2.3 billion in career and technical training and adult education to support the long-term sustainability of our nation's skilled workforce, including for state grants. That is important. I'll give an example. So I went to a trade school first to become a steam fitter. I then, with those funds that I made, was able to go to college. When I first got out of college, one of the jobs that I could have taken paid me about, I think it was probably $18 an hour. I did get health care though. No pension, things like that. No vacation fund. But I could have left that job and made, let's see, total package, probably about 6 times more than that, which I did end up doing. But, $16 after going to college in comparison to, let's see, I think it's like, well, I get paid 10% above scale. So about $96, somewhere around there an hour. There's a big difference. In that comment, I mean, that's our total package, right? So that's with fringe benefits. Let's see, elementary and secondary education. Okay, good. Critical investments in equitable access to the learning opportunities students need to succeed. Oh yeah, and the reason why I made that comment before is just there needs to be this investment in these technical fields that people can get into because it's an education and you get significantly paid more if you have a marketable skill. It's important to get. Getting back to it. $18.6 billion for Title I, an increase of $200 million compared to the fiscal year 2024 annualized CR level. This increases its funding, and it would help schools with high rates of poverty sustain critical investments in academic acceleration and achievements made with ARP funds and make critically needed new investments in high-quality instruction. Increasing access to a well-rounded education, including through expanding access to preschool. $8 billion in new mandatory funding for academic acceleration and achievement grants. This provides high-quality tutoring and expanding summer, extended, and after-school learning opportunities. This also makes a note of increasing student attendance and engagement. $25 million for school districts to expand free high-quality preschool, in-school, and community-based settings. That's really important. This includes Head Start for children eligible to attend Title I schools. Those are all great programs. Things like that also free up the parents to work and make more money. And $940 million for English language acquisition state grants, $162 million for ED's Office for Civil Rights. Okay, this thing is like a ton of money, but I think I've read enough to get the point across. that these are positive things. Positive things. Good. We should keep it. And again, that these go to different types of funding. A lot for services of people that come from a minority background. Very important. And I'm including first-generation college students in that minority background, even though it's not necessarily a minority in population. It's a minority in the fact that not as many people have it. Okay. I think we've gone through a lot. Been going for about an hour and a half. So I think I'm going to wrap it up here. But I think we covered a lot, and I think it demonstrates that this is important, and these federal funds aren't wasted. They're going to important things, and we should continue that investment. Continue that investment. All right. Well, thank you for joining. You can find other things such as articles at www.tospeakonline.com. You can also follow us on Spotify and any other major distribution platform of podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, and I appreciate your time. I hope you got some good information out of this, and I'm thinking about doing more. So let me know what you think.